Welcome back to Dark Tides, where we explore the shadowy history of smuggling along the North Devon coast. This podcast was created by Devon History Tours, and today we're going to delve deeper into the organised gangs that controlled this illicit trade, the authorities who fought to stop them, and the ingenious methods used to transport and conceal contraband. From hidden caves to secret tunnels, from brandy wine to French lace, this is the story of North Devon's shadow economy. In our first episode, we introduced you to North Devon's rugged coastline and the economic conditions that made smuggling not just profitable, but for many, a necessary means of survival. Today we'll explore how this illicit trade was organised, the networks that sustained it, and the cat and mouse game played between smugglers and the authorities. The gangs of North Devon. While many imagine smugglers as romantic outlaws or desperate individuals, the reality of North Devon smuggling was far more organised. Records from the 17th through 19th centuries reveal sophisticated operations run by what we might today call criminal syndicates. From Cornwall to the area around Hartland Point, the fearsome cruel Coppinger led a gang that combined smuggling with wrecking. According to the Journal of Reverend Stephen Hawker, who documented many North Devon smuggling tales,
Coppinger's men would extinguish the lighthouse beacons on stormy nights and light false fires to draw ships onto the rocks. What could not be purchased honestly would be taken by darker means.
Local parish records list numerous unexplained deaths during the smuggling times. For example, fishermen who asked too many questions, or witnesses who threatened to report to authorities. While the larger gangs could muster dozens of men, smaller family operations were also common. The Davy family of Lynmouth controlled the smuggling routes through the Valley of the Rocks for 3 generations. Local law documented in the Exmoor Parish records of 1802 tells how Patriarch Thomas Davy established a complex system of signals, using lanterns hung in specific trees to indicate when revenue officers were in the area. This family business extended beyond simple smuggling. According to court records from Exeter Assizes in 1815, the Davies maintained legitimate shipping interests as a front for their smuggling activities. Their fishing boats, the Maid of Lynmouth and Lady Fortune, made regular trips to France and returned with holds full of contraband hidden beneath modest catches of fish. The gangs didn't operate in isolation. Letters seized by customs officials in 1792 reveal an interconnected network spanning from Cornwall to Somerset. The Brotherhood of the Coast, as they call themselves, encoded correspondence, coordinated shipments, shared intelligence about customs patrols, and even had an informal insurance system whereby losses from seizures would be partially compensated by other members. These weren't just bands of roughnecks. Smuggling gangs in North Devon included members from all levels of society. A remarkable document found in the archives of Barnstaple Guildhall lists prominent merchants, a parish clerk, and even a magistrate among those suspected of involvement in the free trade. The document, dated 1763, was written by a frustrated customs officer named William Trevelyan.
The conspiracy of silence extends to the highest offices in the county. When seizures are made, witnesses suddenly lose their memories, evidence disappears from locked rooms, and even fellow officers may be found looking the other way for consideration of coin or goods.
The social reach of these gangs made them particularly difficult to combat. The diary of Mary Bassett, wife of a customs collector in Ilfracombe, provides a glimpse into this reality.
My husband returned home in low spirits again today. He had arranged to intercept a shipment at Heel Bay based on reliable information, only to find the beach deserted and signs of recent activity. Later, he learned that the Justice of Peace himself had sent warning of the raid. We are surrounded by those who profit from this trade, and even our neighbours regard us with suspicious eyes.
The contraband trade. So what exactly were these gangs smuggling? Tax records and seizure reports give us a detailed picture of the contraband that flowed through North Devon's coves and inlets. Brandy was perhaps the most smuggled item. French brandies could be purchased for about 3 shillings per gallon across the Channel, but would fetch 28 shillings in England due to heavy duties. Customs records from Bideford show that in 1734 alone, over 5,000 gallons of brandy were seized, suggesting that many times that amount successfully made it through. A single successful voyage could carry hundreds of tubs of spirits, referred to as guinea tubs, because they would fetch roughly a guinea in profit each. These were specially designed for smuggling, flattened on one side to make them stable when lashed to a pack pony, and often painted black to make them less visible at night. But spirits were far from the only contraband. Tobacco from the American colonies and later the Caribbean was immensely profitable. The Diary of a Linton Merchant from 1780 notes,
"The Virginia leaf arrives via Guernsey, where it is repacked into smaller parcels for the crossing to our shores. A single successful landing may yield profit enough to purchase a farm outright, even after all involved have received their share."
Silk and lace from France and the Low Countries were particularly valuable due to their high price-to-weight ratio. These luxury goods were heavily taxed to protect English manufacturers, creating a lucrative black market. The seizure records from the Custom House at Barnstaple list confiscations of Flemish lace of the finest quality and lion silk sufficient to outfit a dozen ladies of fashion. Tea became increasingly important in the smuggling trade throughout the 18th century, as it grew in popularity while remaining heavily taxed. By the 1770s, it's estimated that over £7 million of tea was smuggled into Britain annually, with Devon being a major entry point. Less commonly discussed were the dark sides of this trade. Customs records occasionally mention opium coming through North Devon ports, particularly after the 1700s, when the East India Company began large-scale production in India. While some was destined for legitimate medical use, much entered the growing underground market for the drug. Human smuggling also occurred, though less frequently. During periods of political unrest in France, particularly during the Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, North Devon smugglers transported aristocrats fleeing the guillotine, spies carrying messages, and deserters from both armies. The Memoirs of François Dubois, a French émigré, describes his journey from France to a small cove on the North Devon coast in 1794, for which he paid an exorbitant sum to men who seemed equally comfortable smuggling brandy or desperate souls. Methods and routes. The geography of North Devon's coastline made it ideal for smuggling. High cliffs, isolated beaches, and countless small coves provided perfect landing spots away from the watchful eyes of customs men. The most common method of bringing goods to shore was known as tub running. Large ships would anchor offshore, beyond the 3-mile limit of customs jurisdiction. Under cover of darkness, flotillas of small boats would row out to meet them. The contraband would be transferred to these boats, which would then make for predetermined landing spots along the coast. One such operation is vividly described in the records of a court case against Jonathan Hoare, and 6 others at Exeter Assizes in 1789.
The ship Grey Gull stood 3 leagues off Mort Point, while 14 small boats approached from the direction of Woolacombe. Each boat returned laden with tubs and packages, landing at various points between Mort and Baggy Point. A chain of men, like ants on their hill, passed the goods up the cliff paths to waiting ponies. Within 2 hours, all evidence of their activities had vanished as completely as morning mist.
The logistics of these operations were impressive. A single large shipment might require dozens of men, scores of pack horses, and careful coordination of signals. The account books of a Bideford merchant seized in 1805 revealed a sophisticated network, including dedicated lookouts, horsemen, boat crews, and inland distribution agents, each paid according to their role and risk. Once landed, the contraband needed to be transported quickly. Pack ponies were ideal for this purpose, small enough to navigate narrow cliff paths, but strong enough to carry substantial loads. A train of ponies could move silently through the night, a long route specifically chosen to avoid populated areas. These routes became known as smugglers' roads, and many still exist today as footpaths or bridleways. The Devon County Archives contain a remarkable map, dated 1792, seized from a smuggler captured near Combe Martin. It shows a network of paths connecting landing beaches to inland distribution points, with notations indicating safe houses, watch points, and areas to avoid. One such route led from Heddon's Mouth, a secluded cove west of Linton, up through the Valley of the Rocks, skirting around Linton itself, and then inland via paths that are now part of Exmoor National Park. At various points along these routes, smugglers established caches where goods could be temporarily hidden if there was danger of discovery. But sea routes were equally important. The North Devon Journal of 1823 reported an innovative approach.
The vessels engaged in this illicit trade often fly false colours and papers. They adopt the practice of carrying double crews so that while half remain to work the ship, the others can quickly load boats and make for shore. Some vessels have been discovered with false bottoms, hidden compartments, and water tanks converted to spirit storage.
Smugglers from North Devon maintained regular routes to Guernsey and Jersey in the Channel Islands, which operated as free ports where goods could be purchased without duty. From there, the crossing to the Devon coast could be made in a single night with favourable winds. Other routes connected to Roscoff and St Malo in Brittany were particularly used for French goods like brandy, wine and lace. Hiding places. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of North Devon's smuggling history is the ingenious hiding places used to conceal contraband, both temporarily and long-term. Natural caves were the most obvious choice. The coastline between Ilfracombe and Combe Martin features numerous sea caves accessible only at low tide, or by boat. Heddon's Mouth Cave, Sampson's Cave, and the network of caverns at Watermouth were all documented hiding places in customs records. The caves at Rapparee Cove still have the evidence of keel marks from the boats as they were dragged inside. However, most caves around the coast were not really used as storage, but more of a way of transporting goods undercover and away from prying eyes. At high tide, all caves were underwater, and items like lace, tobacco, and other perishable goods would have been ruined within days and meant a huge loss of revenue to the smuggler. Archaeological excavations at Widmouth Cave in the 1960s revealed evidence of extensive use by smugglers, including modified stone platforms, rusted iron rings set into the walls likely for securing boats, and fragments of ceramic vessels consistent with 18th century brandy containers. But smugglers didn't rely solely on natural features. They created ingenious hiding places throughout the region. The Architectural Survey of Historic Buildings in North Devon, completed in 1975, identified over 40 properties with structural features specifically designed for concealing contraband. The old Customs House Inn at Instow, ironically named as it was never an official customs house, was found to have a false chimney that concealed a narrow storage space large enough to hold dozens of tubs of spirits. St Peter's Church in Trentishire contained a hidden chamber beneath the vestry floor, discovered during renovations in 1908. Inside were found the remains of several small kegs and a tarnished silver flask engraved with the date 1742. The Journal of Revenue Officer Thomas Benson describes his frustration after a raid on a farmhouse near Paracombe in 1756.
Though we had certain intelligence that upwards of 100 tubs had been transported to the property of Mr. Hancock, upon execution of our warrant, we found nothing. The house and outbuildings were searched most thoroughly. Walls sounded, floors examined, and yet no trace was found. It was as if the spirits had turned to air and vanished.
3 years later, after the property changed hands, the new owner discovered an ingenious system of sliding panels that revealed a space between the inner and outer walls of the house, large enough to conceal several men as well as substantial quantities of goods. Not all hiding places were in buildings. The dense woodlands of the Heddon Valley and around Arlington Court provided natural coverage for temporary storage. Local folklore, later confirmed by archaeological finds, tells of hollowed-out tree trunks used to store small kegs. The ancient oak known as crookhorn tree near Paracoombe was found, when it fell during a storm in 1920, to have been deliberately hollowed with a small, carefully concealed door cut into its trunk. Underground caches were also common. The diary of Mary Burton, resident of Combe Martin, in the 1820s, describes an incident when her husband was digging a new well.
John had reached a depth of some 8 feet when his spade struck something that gave a hollow sound. Clearing away more earth, he discovered a wooden platform covering a pit nearly 6 feet deep and lined with stone. Inside were 12 small kegs, long emptied of their contents, but unmistakably of the type used to transport French spirit. We questioned old Mr. Davy about it, and he merely smiled and said that many gardens in the village might yield similar treasures if one knew where to dig.
One of the most elaborate systems of hiding places was discovered at Bucks Mills near Clovelly. Renovations in the 1950s revealed that several cottages in this small coastal hamlet were connected by tunnels to caves at the base of the cliff. Evidence suggests these tunnels were in active use for smuggling from at least the 1750s through the early 19th century. Law enforcement and prevention. As smuggling flourished, the authorities fought back with increasing determination and resources. The cat-and-mouse game between smugglers and customs officers defined much of life in coastal North Devon for centuries. The primary responsibility for combating smuggling fell to the customs service, assisted at times by excise officers, and, in particularly troublesome periods, the military.
Open in the king's name! Open utterly!
The Barnstaple Custom House records show a gradual increase in personnel assigned to North Devon throughout the 18th century, from just 3 riding officers in 1705 to over 20 by 1780. These riding officers patrolled the coast on horseback, watching for suspicious vessels offshore and signs of landing activity. They were often locals themselves, placing them in difficult positions when confronting smugglers who might be neighbours or even relatives. The Journal of William Prowse, a riding officer stationed at Ilfracombe from 1742 to 1751, reveals these tensions.
Today, I encountered John Davy leading 2 ponies near Heel. From the shape of their loads, covered though they were with hay, I knew them to be carrying tubs. Yet Davy's wife is cousin to my own, and his children play with my son on Sundays. I pretended not to notice the irregular shape beneath the covering and rode on, hating myself for my weakness, but unable to bring ruin to his family.
For larger operations, the Customs Service maintained armed cutters, which were fast-sailing vessels that patrolled offshore. The most famous of these operating in North Devon waters was the Sprightly, a 16-gun cutter captained by the notorious Richard Goodwin. Customs records credit the Sprightly with over 40 successful seizures between 1790 and 1798. A significant boost to law enforcement came with the establishment of the Coast Blockade in 1816, followed by the formation of the Coast Guard in 1822. This new force established watch stations at regular intervals along the coast, with particular concentration on known smuggling hotspots. In North Devon, guard stations were established at Lynmouth, Combe Martin, Ilfracombe, Mort Point, Croyd, and Baggy Point. Each station housed a small detachment of men, equipped with telescopes, signal flags, and, when necessary, weapons. The architecture of these stations was distinctive. The main building always featuring a high observation room with windows facing in all directions, particularly seaward. The legal framework for combating smuggling also evolved over time. The 1662 Act for Preventing Frauds established the basic structure of customs enforcement, but it was the draconian smuggling acts of 1736 and 1746 that significantly raised the stakes. The death penalty was introduced for smugglers who resisted arrest while armed, and substantial rewards were offered for information leading to seizures. These harsh measures reflected the government's frustration with the scale of lost revenue. Treasury records estimate that in the mid-18th century, nearly 40% of all tea and tobacco consumed in Britain evaded duty, while for brandy and gin, the figure approached 80%. Despite these efforts, smuggling remained difficult to suppress. In a letter to the Treasury dated 1767, the Collector of Customs at Barnstaple lamented,
"The inhabitants of these shores have engaged in the illicit trade for generations. When we increase our patrols in one area, they simply shift their landings elsewhere. We seize one shipment in 20 at most, and the profits on the 19 ensure that the trade continues."
The most effective measure ultimately proved to be economic rather than enforcement-based. William Pitt's Commutation Act of 1784 dramatically reduced duties on tea from 119% to 12.5%, making legal importation financially viable and smuggling less profitable. Similar reductions in other duties throughout the early 19th century gradually eroded the economic foundations of the smuggling trade. When smugglers were caught, punishment could be severe. The Exeter Assizes records from 1715 to 1830 contain dozens of cases involving North Devon smugglers. Sentences ranged from heavy fines to transportation to the colonies and, in cases involving violence against officers, execution. One particularly notorious case was that of the Lynmouth Seven in 1819, after a bloody confrontation at Ringapeak Cove in which 2 revenue officers were killed. 7 men from Lynmouth were tried for murder. Despite considerable local sympathy and witnesses who suddenly developed convenient memory lapses, all were found guilty. 4 were hanged at Exeter Castle, while 3 were transported to Australia for life. Yet for every smuggler caught, many more continued to operate. Local support for smuggling remained strong, with many coastal communities viewing it as a legitimate response to excessive taxation rather than a true crime. This attitude is captured in a popular North Devon saying recorded in 1790,
"It's no sin to wet the king's beard,"
meaning that depriving the monarch of a small portion of his tax revenue was no moral failing. Wrecking the darker side. While smuggling was often viewed with a certain romantic tolerance, wrecking was considered beyond the pale even by many who engaged in the free trade. Wrecking took 2 forms. Passive wrecking involved the salvage of goods from ships that had naturally run aground. Technically illegal, if not reported, but widely practiced. The image of North Devon wreckers deliberately luring ships to their doom with false lights is more legend than reality. Historical records show few confirmed cases of intentional wrecking. However, it did occur, but on a small scale. Court records from 1705 describe one such case near Mort Point.
The accused, Richard Hole and Samuel Tucker, are charged with causing the wreck of the merchant vessel Mary Jane. By displaying lights upon Mort Point, thereby causing said vessel to strike upon rocks with loss of goods valued at £3,200 and the lives of 9 mariners.
Both men were acquitted due to lack of evidence, a common outcome in such cases, as witnesses were reluctant to come forward. The dangerous reputation of the North Devon coast was not entirely undeserved. Mort Point was known as Death Point for good reason, and the coastline from Hartland to Ilfracombe claimed numerous vessels every year through natural hazards alone. The temptation to assist fate proved too strong for some coastal communities, particularly during hard times. The diary of Reverend Raymond of Morto, dating from 1760, expresses his moral outrage.
"I have preached most forcefully against the abominable practice, reminding my congregation that to cause shipwreck is murder most foul. Yet after the wreck of the Portuguese vessel last Michaelmas, I observed items in cottages that could only have come from her hold. When I questioned this, I was met with sullen silence or tales of finding goods washed upon the shore, as if the sea itself had offered them as gifts."
The North Devon coast was often named the Sailor's Grave. It was said that sailors would rather drown at sea than come onto the shores of Mort Ho, as they knew what their fate was. Death. Elizabeth Berry was a notorious wrecker. She was reputed to have lured ships onto the shore. Once the boats became stranded or damaged, she would drown the sailors by using a pitchfork to hold them down in the sea until they died. She would then take their possessions for her own. Elizabeth was born in 1798 in West Down. She would marry John Berry in 1819. The family would live in Mort Ho, where their life would have been hard, and money scarce for their growing family. Elizabeth was arrested in 1850 for plundering the William and Jane brig and given 21 days hard labour for her crimes. She was further arrested for wrecking on Barricane Beach. When questioned by the Ilfracombe receiver about a sack containing a tub and a bed sack that she was dragging, Elizabeth's aggressive and evasive replies set her on a course for the magistrate's court. Unable to pay the £1 fine, she was sentenced to hard labour with prison discipline. Elizabeth and her family would eventually leave Mort Ho, with many of the family moving for work in Swansea. Folklore from the region contains numerous tales of wreckers who received supernatural punishment for the crimes that they committed. The ghost ship of Bideford is said to appear during storms as a warning to sailors, is reportedly crewed by the spirits of wreckers, doomed to sail the coastline forever as punishment for their crimes. Archaeological evidence confirms that wrecking did occur, though perhaps less systematically than folklore suggests. Excavations at a cottage near Croyd, conducted in 1978, uncovered a hidden chamber containing ship's equipment, including a compass and speaking trumpet dating from approximately 1780. These items would have been valuable for their original purpose, but would be peculiar souvenirs unless specifically collected from a wreck. The most infamous alleged wrecker of North Devon was the cruel Coppinger, who operated around Cornwall and Hartland in the late 18th century. While some historians question whether he was one person or a composite character created from multiple smugglers, contemporary accounts describe him as leading a gang that combined smuggling with deliberate wrecking. The North Devon Journal of 1792 reported,
"The magistrates have issued warrants for the arrest of the man known as Coppinger, in connection with the wreck of the brig Elizabeth near Hartland. Witnesses allege that the navigation light was extinguished and false lights displayed on the night in question. 3 crew members died, and cargo valued at over £1,500 was lost, much of it later seen in the possession of known associates of the wanted man."
Coppinger was never arrested, reportedly fleeing to Ireland ahead of the authorities. His legend grew in his absence, with increasingly elaborate tales of cruelty and supernatural abilities becoming attached to his name. By the early 19th century, improvements in navigation and the establishment of reliable lighthouses significantly reduced shipwrecks, making wrecking less viable. The Lighthouse Act of 1836 placed navigational beacons under central control, making it more difficult to interfere with them for nefarious purposes. Decline and legacy. By the mid-19th century, the golden age of smuggling along the North Devon coast was drawing to a close. Multiple factors contributed to its decline. The introduction of steam-powered customs vessels in the 1820s significantly tilted the balance in favour of law enforcement. These ships could patrol regardless of wind conditions and easily overtake the sailing vessels used by smugglers. The Vigilant, a paddle steamer assigned to the Bristol Channel in 1833, was credited with intercepting 12 smuggling vessels in its first year of operation alone. Economic reforms also played a crucial role. Free trade policies championed by Richard Cobden and John Bright led to the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 and a general reduction in import duties. As legal imports became cheaper, the profit margin on smuggled goods shrank, making the risks less worthwhile. The personal accounts of former smugglers provide insight into this transition. John Bray of Clovelly, interviewed for a local history project in 1898, recalled,
"When I was a young man, half the village was engaged in the trade one way or another. A successful run meant good food on many tables. But by the time I was 40, it was hardly worth the risk. The duties came down, the preventive men got their steam cutters, and the old ways faded. The last run I recall was in 51 or thereabouts, just a few kegs of brandy, nothing like the old days when we'd bring in hundreds of tubs at a time."
The improved infrastructure of Victorian Britain also contributed to the decline. Better roads and the coming of railways to North Devon in the 1850s integrated the region more closely with the rest of the country, reducing both the isolation that had facilitated smuggling and the economic hardship that had motivated it. The Coast Guard, established in 1822, grew increasingly professional and effective. By 1850, the North Devon coast was dotted with Coast Guard stations at regular intervals. making undetected landings much more difficult. The archives of the Ilfracombe station record only 3 significant seizures between 1850 and 1860, compared to 17 in the 1820s. This is not to say that smuggling disappeared entirely. Customs seizure records show occasional interceptions throughout the late 19th century, but these were typically small-scale operations rather than the organised gang activities of earlier decades. The 1876 annual report for the North Devon Customs District notes,
Smuggling, once the scourge of these shores, has dwindled to insignificance. Occasional small quantities of spirits or tobacco are still introduced illegally, typically by individual sailors rather than organised bands. The systematic smuggling trade has, to all intents and purposes, been extinguished.
The physical legacy of this history remains visible throughout North Devon. Many of the hiding places have been preserved or rediscovered, like the secret room at the Rising Sun Inn at Lynmouth, which is concealed behind the fireplace, is now a tourist attraction. The cave system at Watermouth Castle, once used for storing contraband, is open to visitors. Place names throughout the region reflect this heritage. Brandy Cove near Heddon's Mouth, Smugglers Valley, situated at Lee, and Run Cove at Hartland all commemorate locations associated with the illicit trade. Local folklore preserves the memory of notable smugglers and their exploits, often with considerable embellishment. Archaeological work continues to uncover new evidence. In 2012, during renovation work at the Grampus Inn, located at Lee Bay, revealed a previously unknown cellar containing several intact 18th century brandy kegs. In 2017, marine archaeologists identified the wreck of the Swift, a known smuggling vessel that sank off Baggy Point in 1819 while being pursued by a revenue cutter. The cultural impact of smuggling extended beyond physical artefacts. Folk songs collected from North Devon in the late 19th century include numerous ballads celebrating successful smugglers or lamenting those caught and punished. The Lynmouth Smugglers' Song and the Ballad of Cruel Coppinger remain part of local musical tradition. Even language was affected. The Dialect Dictionary of North Devon, compiled in 1902, lists numerous terms specific to smuggling. Darkmans for night, tubmen for those who carried spirits, letterman for a lookout, and gentleman as the euphemism for contraband goods. For 3 centuries, smuggling defined much of life along the North Devon coast. It shaped communities, created fortunes, and occasionally cost lives. Its gradual decline marked the transition from an isolated, semi-feudal region to a more integrated modern economy. The smugglers are gone, but their legacy lingers in the hidden rooms, secret paths, and enduring stories of North Devon's dramatic coastline. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Dark Tide's Smugglers of the North Devon coast. In our next episode, we will explore in more detail the lives of some of the known smugglers and wreckers like Thomas Benson, Alexander Otway of Chambercombe Manor, and Hannibal Richards of Lee Bay. We will also look at recorded wrecking and smuggling incidents in more detail. Until then, remember the old Devon saying, "What the eye doesn't see, the king doesn't get." Goodbye.